Welcome, everybody, to the American Library in Paris. And thank you for joining us tonight for Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. I see some new faces. How many of you here are new to the library, besides Alissa? Welcome. Well, guess what? We just had a birthday. We just turned 105. And we are the largest English language lending library on the European continent, a nonprofit open to everybody. My name is Mayanne Wright, and I'm the docent here at the library. I give a history talk every Friday and help out with these evening events. Tonight, we are delighted to have Alissa Wilkinson, who is a New York Times film critic, and Joanna Scutts, who is a literary critic. And they're going to be discussing Alissa's book tonight, We Tell Ourselves Stories, Joan Didion and the American Dream Machine, a cultural history of the relationship between American mythmaking in Hollywood and Joan Didion's writings. The conversation will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Sound like a good deal? All right, so Alissa, let me give you a little bit more information about Alissa here. As I said, she is a film critic at the New York Times and was formerly a senior correspondent and critic at Vox. Her previous book, Salty, Lessons on Eating, Drinking, and Living from Revolutionary Women, was published in 2022. Joanna Scutts is a writer and literary critic based here in Paris. She is a regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review, and her work has appeared in The Guardian, New Republic, Times Literary Supplement, and The New Yorker. Her book focuses on overlooked women's histories of the early 20th century and includes, are you ready? Firebrands, 25 women writers to enrich your reading life. And Hotbed, Bohemian New York and the secret club that sparked modern feminism. Her new project explores the history of American women in Paris. Would you please join me in a warm welcome for Alissa and Joanna? Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's lovely to be here, and I'm so glad to be able to talk to Alissa about her wonderful book. I'm sure that we're going to have lots to talk about. The structure of the evening is fairly simple. I'm going to ask her some questions. We're going to have a discussion about the book, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. She's going to start with a short reading, one of the rare moments when our heroine steps foot in France. So let's hear about that.
So I chose this partly because it begins at the Cannes Film Festival, which begins tonight, and I'm headed down there in the morning. But the only other thing I want to say is that the couple here is Joan Didion and her husband, John Gregory Dunn, who she was a screenwriting partner with for their whole career. In May of 1971, the couple went to the Cannes Film Festival, Didion's first trip abroad at age 37. She boarded the plane barefoot. Cannes was then, as now, not just another film festival. An aura of glamour and consequence hangs over the place, from its palatial hotels to its iconic red carpet, to the yachts bobbing in the bay just across the Croisette. It's where the film world collides with itself, and the glitterati aren't just there to see movies, they're there to make deals. Less film festival than agricultural fair, as Dunn put it. They were there for the premiere of The Panic in Needle Park, their first produced screenplay, which they decided to write because, as Dunn would later put it, no one was asking us to do any other film work. The movie was the doomed love story of two young addicts. 2 years earlier, Didion and Dunn had temporarily moved into a hotel near Manhattan's Needle Park, the area around Broadway and 72nd Street where, 50 years later, a handsomely renovated subway station a few blocks north of Lincoln Center would stand flanked by pizza shops and a Trader Joe's. They'd researched the milieu of the film heavily, at one point paying junkies to shoot up in front of them. They needed to see the doom for themselves. The film was shot in 1970 and starred two theater actors, Kitty Wynn, who'd never been on screen before, and Al Pacino, whose cinema resume boasted one supporting role. At Cannes, The Panic and Needle Park garnered mixed reviews. Yet it must have played well in the room. The Cannes jury chose Kitty Wynn for the Best Actress prize. Their movie may not have struck the American press as particularly commercial, but it was now award-winning, as well as a spectacular launchpad toward eventual stardom for young Pacino. It was confirmation for the pair that they belonged in Hollywood. Or near Hollywood, anyhow. They were living and throwing parties and hosting producers in their Malibu house, a good 50 miles from the nearest movie studio, to discuss story development with executives. Dunn explained that when these meetings took place, they tried to host them in their home and always served the same lunch: a cold leek soup, antipasto, baguettes of French bread, fruit, brie, and white wine. This menu was purposeful. The lunch is programmed to reinforce the notion that the turf is ours and that it would be bad form for a guest to push aberrant ideas, he wrote. We are no longer employees, but host and hostess. Sometimes it works. They were in demand now, with studios regularly seeking them out to draft or doctor scripts, fixing screenplays written by other people to make them more suitable for production. In the meantime, they were working on the screenplay for Didion's novel, Play It As It Lays, a smart move given the book's success. Its enormous success. Didion's Hollywood novel was every bit as depressing as The Panic in Needle Park, but given it's centered on glamorous Hollywood types, it probably seemed more palatable as a film. But they were becoming sanguine about the kind of writing by committee that is done on most movies, with producers and even stars requesting changes to characters, dialogue, settings, and plot points. They didn't think of screenwriting as their art, and thus lacked the ego that other screenwriters could display. They'd push back against ideas that seemed bad to them, but at the end of the day, this was a job. Meanwhile, they believed, all those critics back in New York simply had no idea how the business really worked. They thought wrongly that Hollywood movies were the work of a single visionary genius. In a 1973 essay entitled In Hollywood, Didion wrote that some people who write about films were so detached from the circus of production that they'll never understand the social or emotional reality of the process. She had a particular beef with the writing of Pauline Kael, her old column mate at Vogue. And in Hollywood, she aired it out a bit. I used to wonder how Pauline Kael, say, could slip in and out of such airy subordinate clauses as now that the studios are collapsing. She clearly enjoyed chastising Kael's ideas about what Hollywood parties were like. These stereotypes, Didion concludes, derive less from Hollywood life than from some weird West Side Playhouse 90 about Hollywood life. Kael and Didion had a lot in common, even apart from writing the same column at Vogue for a while. They were both from Northern California, both went to UC Berkeley, but they were different and opinionated and snarked at one another in print. And Kael found Didion as ridiculous, pathetic, and dramatic as Didion found Kael clueless. By the 1970s, Kael was at the top of her game, a make-or-break critic with a loyal following. When the film version of Play It As It Lays came out, Kael wrote about her disdain for the book, saying she read it between bouts of disbelieving giggles. Dunn struck back a year later, writing in the Los Angeles Times book review of Kael's implacable ignorance of the mechanics of filmmaking, declaring that she is always blaming the cellist for the tuba solo. In other words, Kael has little to no understanding of how movies actually get made, and it shows in her writing. Yet, he said, she was never called on it, because her audience knows even less of those mechanics than she does, and professional film people do not wish to incur her displeasure by calling attention to it. He confessed to even turning down an opportunity to review Kael's book, Raising Cain, because he had a movie coming out and he didn't want to get on her bad side. Looking back, Didion and Dunn were partly right and partly wrong about the solely craven nature of the American movie business. Perhaps they couldn't, or wouldn't, put themselves in the mindset of some of the people they partied with, who held loftier aspirations for the medium and sometimes were able to execute them. The truth is that in recovering from the tumultuous but invigorating 1960s, Hollywood produced some of its best work, and the audiences responded. It was a heyday for artistically minded filmmaking that reflected and sometimes prodded the paranoia and conspiratorial anxiety of its audience. It was not an era destined to stick around for long.
Thank you so much. I think you'll see from that extract just how much is packed into this book, this really wonderful layering of biography, personality, and also these larger questions of both filmmaking, film culture, and the sort of wider American landscape. So I thought I might just start by asking you to talk a little bit about the genesis of this project, how you came to sort of weave together Didion's film criticism, her film work, her day job, for many, many years in Hollywood and in that world, and then sort of how that builds her ideas about American society, and we'll come on to American politics, but yeah, how that all came together for you in this book.
So about 5 years ago, my agent, who I had newly signed with in the most normal time of the world, April 2020, was like, maybe you should write a book about Joan Didion. And immediately that seemed correct. She had been important to me. I'd read The Year of Magical Thinking without knowing what it was about when it first came out. And it happened to be right when my father had passed away very suddenly when he was 46. And so there was sort of this, I understood her as a writer who talked about things differently than I had experienced before. And so immediately I knew that was right, but it took me the summer to figure out what would a book about Joan Didion that I want to write be about, because there's a very good biography by Tracy Doherty that came out in 2015, and I also knew that everybody loves Joan Didion, even if they haven't read her. And so I wanted to find the angle that made sense for me and that made sense for the moment. So I spent the summer rereading everything, watching all the movies, thinking about what hasn't been said about her already. And she was still alive at the time. And I was reading Political Fictions, which is her book of essays on American politics from the 80s and 90s. It's all basically all reporting she did for the New York Review of Books. And it was published on September 11th, 2001. And there's an essay in there called Insider Baseball. And that essay is about her following among other things, the Michael Dukakis campaign. And in it, she's a very new political reporter. She's sort of just moved from Hollywood back to New York. They're still working as screenwriters, but they're kind of back in New York City. And you watch her discover what campaigns are all about, because she is watching all the political press watch the candidate. So she's watching the press watch the candidate, and she's listening to the handlers, and she's hearing them say things about setting up the shot and about how we need to retake this and how we need to kind of do all these things that suddenly to her are very familiar, and you can kind of feel it pinging the back of her brain, and she's like, oh, I've seen this before on set. I mean, a few years earlier, she and John had written the first couple drafts of The Star is Born with Barbra Streisand, right? Like, they were very familiar with the territory. That, for me, was the moment where the whole book clicked into place, because I suddenly was like, oh, wait, she sees American culture as slowly becoming more a product of Hollywood, and particularly American political culture as she becomes a political reporter. And she's worked in Hollywood. And when I go back in her biography, I discover how much she is formed as a product of Hollywood. She's not from Southern California, she's from Northern California, but she writes very lovingly of her time watching John Wayne movies as a kid on Air Force bases, and just like kind of how her whole imagination is formed by Hollywood. And that created an arc that was pretty easy to follow. So I guess following Joan, I like told myself a story about her. But once you kind of see her movie language popping up, you see it everywhere. Like even all the way back to Goodbye to All That, which is a quite early essay about leaving New York. The language in that is fully cinematic. She talks about watching herself, about the movies, about like edit rooms and montages. And once you see it, you realize this is like a big perspective for her. And that felt underexplored for me. So I wanted to, and it made sense, obviously, for me, a movie critic, to do it. So that was where I started with it.
It's such a fascinating, it feels to me like there's two elements then of sort of the way that Hollywood sort of infuses her worldview. And one of them is sort of this idea that we are shaped by movies as just a kind of sense of how narrative works. You talk a lot about the title of your book, We Tell Ourselves Stories, from her famous opening line to the White Album, that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And that way in which that is misinterpreted and sort of taken out of context and seems to mean a lot of different things to different people, but you sort of, in a very broad sense, this idea that we are sort of primed by our culture, by popular culture, by media to impose narrative on our circumstances, on history. We sort of see things through the lens of narrative structure. I want to talk about whether we're still doing that, or now that those narrative structures change. But so there's that aspect of how it shapes her worldview. But the real insight, and what I really learned from this, is that sense of like the mechanics of the industry, of the idea that it's not that political candidates are necessarily gesturing to grand nostalgic narratives, although they certainly do that, but that they are also hiring staff in this kind of like everyone's expendable, everyone's forgettable, because all you're doing is putting together this one production, and when it's over, everyone disperses, and then maybe they kind of reconvene. But that I feel like is such a this idea that and it came through in the extract that you read, this idea that if you understand how movies are made and how expendable everyone is in that's a big...
It's huge for her. I mean, her kind of arch nemesis is Ronald Reagan, which is funny for multiple reasons. One is he's a California guy, she's a California girl. She hated him all the way back to when he was governor of California. She actually left the Republican Party officially because they backed Nixon, who she had no use for either. But it's very clear from her writing that Nixon was just sort of a waypoint on the way to being like, absolutely not with this guy. But what she doesn't like about either of the Reagans, and actually the meanest thing she ever wrote about was about Nancy Reagan, which is an essay called Pretty Nancy that like kind of leaves blood on the page when you read it, is that they were stage managed, and she felt like you couldn't possibly be governing what she saw as the task of governing if your main reference point was a Hollywood studio, which is in fact something Ronald Reagan talked about himself. She wasn't making this up. I mean, he very much, he would tell the press like, oh, the harder thing about being president is like, you don't have the studio running your business, ha ha ha. And she was like, this is not funny. The world is very scary. And so, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And she, there's Reagan, and then she doesn't actually have any use for anyone afterwards either. She thinks Bill Clinton is full of it. She doesn't like George W. Bush at all. She gets to Obama, and she's kind of like, well, he might be fine, but it's weird that he has fans, and it's weird how they project themselves onto him as a fandom. Like, she actually starts to capture that aspect of our current culture, which really is kind of subsumed American political culture entirely. But I think for her, like, Hollywood is just like fun and fluff, and it's a job, and it's like a product we turn out, and people enjoy it, and that's great. We can pay our mortgage. I like the movies. She says that as early on as possible. But politics is supposed to be something else. And the one politician she loved was Barry Goldwater, who admittedly I knew almost nothing about other than kind of the vague outlines when I started writing this book. So I read some good biographies of him. And like, there's a lot about Barry Goldwater where you're like, really, Joan? Really? But you can kind of see it because he has this aura of independence and kind of the Western cowboy about him that she loved in John Wayne, and I think he kind of matched that for her. But of course, his big opening on the campaign trail was Ronald Reagan. So Joan is a woman of contrast.
Yeah, I think that's another really important part that you bring out so well in the book is, the image of Joan Didion from later in her career as this very sort of cool, detached, I think that's the Didion that from living in New York, I sort of absorbed, that she's sort of a consummate kind of Upper West Side intellectual, even though, and everyone has their own vision of her, and you talk a lot about those iconic photographs and the way in which her image was sort of consciously manufactured. She had fans, which was an irony.
Has fans,
absolutely, and had fans early on, and was very conscious about shaping her image. But it was it's always a little bit of a surprise then to go back, I think, to this woman who was, the very uncool hero worshipping of John Wayne, which you talk a lot about as a sort of childhood thing. But she doesn't really let go of it, and she still keeps it through Goldwater, who is an absolutely despicable, racist, awful, that she, as this very insightful, very intelligent woman, could not see that or could overlook it, is, I think, one of those fault lines that you come across with Joan Didion. You sort of think, oh God, suddenly I'm looking into the abyss here.
Well, yeah, I'd be very curious. So the last thing I can find that she's written about Goldwater is in the preface to Political Fictions, which again, September 11th, 2001, she writes that she would have voted for Goldwater in every election since, had he remained the same age and been running or something like that, which, kudos to her for recognizing that he would have been very old at some point. She shouldn't have voted for him. Anyhow, she then, 2 years later, writes Where I Was From. And if you've read the therapy journals that recently came out, which are worth reading, letters to, it's one of those things. It's notes. Yeah, notes to John. Yeah, because Dear John is too close in a letter. I did read them recently. I was very skeptical. And then I read them and I was like, well, I personally, as a biographer, know there's one fact in here that I didn't know, so maybe it's okay. Everything else is in the public record. And the manuscript apparently is in the New York Public Library archive in full. So there is that. But in any case, you read that, you can see the seeds of Where I Was From. That book to me is the undersung pivot point for Didion. It is the book in which she takes apart her received California and by proxy American mythology. Lots of ideas that she had received from her mother in particular, which are ideas about us being independent. We never took money from the federal government. We built ourselves on our own. And she's writing about coming to a series of sudden realizations, fairly late in life. She's in her 60s at this point, about how that's a story that she'd been telling herself all these decades. And she told herself that in print all these decades. And then 2 years later, she has The Year of Magical Thinking, which is a reevaluation of her mythology about kind of her marriage and herself as a person in the world. And then 2 years after that, Blue Nights, which is a book about her mythology of herself as a mother. So you actually watch her in the last three books she kind of wrote that weren't just collections of things she'd previously written, take apart some of those mythologies. And I would have loved to see her talk about Barry Goldwater late in that period, because I don't know that, I think that may have come in at some point, but she was a writer who was always kind of willing to reevaluate mythologies, even if she didn't get to all of them, I guess, which is really interesting. But I do think Goldwater for her, and many other people, Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl, for a lot of people, he was very popular with young people in particular because he just represented something they were attracted to in that moment. And that was a difficult moment in American history. So she certainly wasn't alone in being kind of a young woman. Also, he was very handsome and charismatic and all of those things.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I'm not going to find the exact quote, it's one of my page flags, but you say at one point that, and I think this is really insightful, that there's nobody, when Didion seems to be attacking somebody or criticizing a worldview, it's almost always something she's criticizing in herself. So, when you were talking about Obama, she's talking about Obama's fans. I mean, some of that must be coming from her own, political fandom, projection. These are things that she's experienced.
There are two places where this shows up in the book in particular. She writes a very scathing piece about Woody Allen in like the Manhattan Annie Hall era. It is like blistering, and I think it might be the first piece she wrote for the New York Review of Books. It's worth, well, you can read my book and read about it, or you can look it up or do both. It's very funny, and it's also very clear that she's aware that she is the people she's criticizing in the kind of the Woody Allen world. The other is she wrote an essay about Martha Stewart that was published in 2000 in the New Yorker. I start the book with it. When the New Yorker had its centennial a couple months ago, Gia Tolentino also wrote an essay about it. It's a very interesting essay to read because it is about Martha Stewart. It's prior to kind of the scandals of Martha Stewart, so she's kind of at her height at that moment. But Martha and Joan have a lot to do with each other in kind of being self-made women and consciously creating an iconography around themselves. And the Stewart essay is very much about it's asking the question, why do young women in particular, idolize Martha Stewart? And when I first read it, I was like, this is an essay about why do young women want to be me, Joan Didion? I don't know. I feel like I'm a mess, And we find out later in the therapy journals, actually, that she had just gone through breast cancer treatment and was going through a lot at that moment. But if you read those in tandem, you sort of see how Didion was constantly trying to understand herself through the world, but it's almost opaque if you don't know the biography at that moment.
Yeah, it's fascinating. She's very good at deflecting and you can come back to this movie language. She tilts the camera away. She's kind of very much about, changing your sight lines a little bit. And I think that's something, that you pick up on really well. I'm curious about this question about her relationship to women and to her fans, because you mention it in the book, but it's not a big part of the story. Her sort of relationship to the women's movement, which she's very dismissive of. And I'm wondering if there's any sense in which, she sort of understood her own exceptionalism, her sort of relationship to gender, and the ways that her career was so unusual and only possible because of fights that women had been the women's organizing, women's groups had been fighting for. I wonder if there's any sense of sort of connection or solidarity that you see her ever really acknowledging. No,
but I do think. It's not like she didn't have like Nora Ephron was a good friend, and Elaine May and people like that. But I think the key piece for me was realizing that Joan moved to New York City sort of against her family's. They didn't try to block her or anything, but it wasn't the kind of thing a girl like her was supposed to do from a nice family in Sacramento. She moved to New York City to work at Vogue in the 1950s. And when I started reading about really the 1950s as opposed to, say, the 1920s in New York, it became very clear that she would have felt like she personally fought her way to the top. She was surrounded by men. She did have sort of a boyfriend/mentor who kind of helped her up the ladder. She was not apologetic about that at all. But every publication one of her, outside of Vogue, which she seemed kind of dismissive about a lot of times, the publication she wrote the most in was National Review, which was in its early days. But Buckley was at that point trying to hire culture writers to write for them that were just good. He didn't really care about the political leanings because he felt that that was the way to be taken seriously as a journal. And this was a point at which issues of National Review ran like 300 pages long. It's crazy when you look them up in the archives. But she's one of the few female voices who shows up in those pages. So I think she would have been very convinced that she got herself there. And at the same time, she was not really coy about the fact that she always worked with her husband, and she let her husband kind of run interference for her a lot. You know, people would talk about how you call their house, they'd both get on the line and he'd do most of the talking. She was a shy person. She was also sick for a lot of her life, which she kind of hid. So there's kind of like multiple sides to it, but I don't feel like, I'm not interested in defending her views on feminism, but I do think they're very representative of her basic outlook on the world, which is she resisted isms, and anytime someone wanted her to like join something, she just walked in the other direction, which is a pretty good place to be if you're a critic, honestly. Like, it's good to be outside of what the expected is, because then hopefully you can see it. But no, I see no indication of solidarity with the feminist cause whatsoever. And in fact, early on in my book tour a couple months ago, someone was like, oh, she's such a feminist icon. And I was like, do not tell her that. She will not appreciate this at all. And I think that's part of why, like, she had a difficult relationship with her daughter, and, you know, there were a lot of kind of difficult things in her life. But you do read her work and realize she is a media critic. Like, that's her, the thing she is best at is looking at media, and that's where her attention is focused a lot of the time, is not what's happening, but how are people talking about what's happening. And I think that was just where her attention lay a lot of the time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think this, I think it's her writing, you know, when she uses this we, when she talks, she uses a sort of collective voice, but it's always really I. It's never, she's never thinking about different subject positions and the possibility of how the world looks different if you are not in the you know, from the position that she is in. And so there's a kind of she's sort of this, you know, she's this camera moving around.
Although it's interesting, there is a piece tucked into the archives. It's never been republished, I think probably for obvious reasons. And it was in this column that she shared with her husband in Life. I want to say Life. And it's really goofy. There's a picture of the both of them, and they were like every other week, or every other issue, one of them would be the voice. And so they'd like flip the heads on the piece, so you would like see Joan in front and then John in front. It's just very funny. But they wrote about all kinds of things, and their voices are completely different, so they're delightful, and more people should read John. But she wrote one called On Becoming a Cop Hater in the 60s, and it's about watching an act of violence by the LAPD on a young black man. And I'm always shocked that this just doesn't come up more, because it is, I mean, she really, I think it's a little ironic, the title is, but she clearly is like completely unsettled from her presumptions about what police do in that column. And that's the kind of thing where I'm like, I don't know totally what's going on there.
Well, yeah, and it's sort of these things that she's such an observant, obviously such an incredibly, you know, she sees so much, but some things radiate and become the story of America, and some things don't. Yes. And it's quite striking to see what doesn't go any further, and what doesn't seem to explain the culture for her. And yeah, I think there's so much in this kind of question of this individualism, and how that just kind of how pervasive it is, and how she sort of clings to it. And then I think the way that your book is structured, I think when we open this up to questions, people will want to talk about some of the political implications. I wonder if you can talk a bit about 9/11, because I found your discussion of her reaction to 9/11 and her skepticism about, especially media, and you know, your esteemed employer, but particularly about, you know, how the New York Times, you know, in what felt very, I was like, oh, we've seen this again recently. You know, the resistance on the part of these very authoritative media outlets to question a narrative that was coming down from from above, come from the government. And I found that surprising that she was, and I wonder if you can talk about how that plays into her, like, post her work in the 2000s.
Yeah, I think from the moment she wrote about, and this is well before that, I think it came out in 91, she wrote Sentimental Journeys, which is a kind of a seminal Didion essay about the brutal assault of the Central Park jogger, and then later the unjust conviction of 5 young boys, one of whom is now a New York City Council person, actually. But oddly, the word Donald Trump never comes up in that essay, even though he took out an ad in the papers to call for their killing, and has never retracted that opinion. But in any case, in that moment, she starts talking about fixed ideas and also about pernicious nostalgia. And this persists, and it clearly becomes like more and more of her thinking about how cities and American culture operate. And when 9/11 happens, which, again, her book was coming out that day. She was scheduled to leave on book tour, and it got delayed by a week. She wrote an essay shortly thereafter called Fixed Ideas America After 9/11, which was then published into a very small book that I really highly recommend. It's very good. And she, kind of a week later, she's living on the Upper East Side. She flies to California, and she does some book tour dates, and she says, I talked to people who kind of clearly understood or felt like they clearly understood what had happened, that there was a series of complicated events that had led to that day. And then she went back to New York, and she said, and it was kind of eerie because I drove into town and there were just like flags everywhere where they weren't before, a moment I remember pretty clearly myself. And she said, and the only place you didn't see them was Harlem, because they knew kind of the danger of fixed ideas and of orthodoxies. And then she criticizes a series that ran in the Times, which I think was something like portraits of people who had died, but she found it very sentimental. And so basically to her, the danger, and I think this is the 21st century danger to her, is the sentimentalization of narratives. That sentimentalization is where we create heightened meaning where it doesn't exist. Like, she writes about people saying, oh, it rained when they had like a service near Ground Zero, and that was like the heavens crying, and like that's just Didion bait. Like, she was like, absolutely not, like it just rained, right? And you can see that kind of actually persist into her personal mythology when she gets to Year of Magical Thinking. It's all about her trying to separate herself from that kind of thinking in her own experience of grief. But she sees the whole country doing it. And I think she never writes about superhero movies, but I do in that context, because of course they pop up right around then. And you see them as a sentimentalization of the need for a hero. That, like, we need someone to save us, and we don't believe we can save ourselves, and we just need some super being to do it. And it's gotten way out of hand. But it's very much in keeping with her perspective on how Americans think about themselves, how New Yorkers think about themselves especially, but also how Californians think about themselves, and those are the two groups of people that she feels qualified to talk about. And she has this feeling that the more sentimental we get about our personal narratives, the less able we are to see the truth, and that seeing the truth is the only way we can actually truly live. And the bigger the stories that we make up are, the less close we are to the truth.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That word sentimentalism emerges around that time in your book, and sort of clearly in her thinking, but it's always there in the background when she's talking about sort of narrative and sort of Hollywood endings. I think with sentimentalism, what happens is it's sort of, it's the ending without the movie. It's just, it's kind of the feeling, yes, that the resolution, the simple, the hero coming to swoop you away, and you don't have all the complicated stuff and all the suspense and everything else leading up to it. You kind of just get those moments. And I wanted to just sort of end by talking about, this idea that perhaps that the narrative of a movie and the structure of a movie, of course, movies are still with us, big Hollywood productions are still with us, But there is this sense that sort of media consumption is fragmenting, is getting smaller, is getting, we are now in the, shorter, these short, intense, disconnected images on TikTok, on various other sites. The idea that we're not seeing like big sweeping narratives so much anymore, as we're seeing an endless succession of little, if not sentimental, then sort of emotionally intense or kind of things that are meant to engage your attention, whether with rage or sentiment or whatever. Like that, it's now this kind of boiled down, quick hit. I'm wondering if some of that is changing the sense of what a narrative, what Didion-esque sort of storytelling means.
Right. So in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, she has a couple of essays, which is published very early in her career. She has a bunch of essays about how different crimes in California are being slotted by Californians into genres, like the noir. She has one in particular about like a crime that happened where a woman I can't quite remember the details, but she set her husband's car on fire when he was sleeping inside, and she's like, it's basically double indemnity. And okay, so that's a long time ago. So you speed up to now, and I think, if I can completely put words in her mouth, which is dangerous, I think the short form video of today, let me put it this way, the overarching narrative is coming from like social media, obviously, which is a boring thing to say, I think. But those short form videos are all designed not to give people different arcs, but to feed into an arc that's building. And so that arc is built by an algorithm, which is built by a company that wants to put its hands in your pockets, right? So there's like a kind of a capitalistic bent to how the stories are constructed today in a way that's different, perhaps, from a Hollywood arc, which is, yes, designed to get you to buy tickets, but also designed to make you feel good. And like a lot of early Hollywood history is about like increasing the morale of the public and like boosting the ethics of the young people and like also making everybody think that this war and that war were fine. Or the Western expansion, whatever. So today it's more about this kind of big arc, right? So I think what I see as where she would have gone if she had written about this, which she didn't, this is me, I guess, is that we live in a world where we're characterized by two things. One is the logic, not of Hollywood, but of reality TV, which is designed to create heightened moments of emotion that are somewhat constructed and you kind of know that, but you do it anyhow. And then within that, moments that can go viral so that everyone will pass them along and say, can you believe that thing happened? And the reality of whatever is happening basically doesn't matter because that's reality. And I think that's probably where she would have landed. Of course, the fan thing obviously is something she also thought about a lot. So all of those things kind of come together. But those little moments aren't designed to be moments unto themselves. They're designed to be like little stones in a very large stone wall that I don't want to keep extending this metaphor because it's going to get really weird very quickly.
Well, we don't have answers, but if Joan did, she's unfortunately can't give them to us. But I think we'll open it up for questions. I'm sure people have lots to ask Alissa. I'd ask that we just keep them brief and keep them as far as possible actual questions. That would be great. Thank you.
Can we have a round of applause? All right, who has a question? You're being shy.
Hi. I was just wondering, what kind of moviegoer was she? Would she go a lot to the movies? On what kind of movies would she go and watch?
This is a great question. Yes.
It's basic.
No, it's a great question. So one thing I didn't mention outright, but she was a movie critic at Vogue for a few years. But prior to that and after that, she was a big moviegoer. So she saw a lot of John Wayne movies as a kid. I mean, this is an era in which you kind of would just go to the movies and then just like see whatever was happening there, which, sounds nice to me. And then so an interesting like piece of this is everyone assumes that Joan Didion was this kind of elitist snob who, clearly would only love like films of the French New Wave in the 1960s. No, she didn't like the French New Wave. She was not very interested in international movies, and she didn't like anything that was going on, as far as I can tell, in the experimental underground in New York at the time either. She liked big Hollywood epics. That was her thing. She loved The Alamo, which is like not a good movie, but she wrote about it in 2 separate publications, is how much she loved it. And then she went through this weird period when they first moved to Los Angeles and when she was writing Play It As It Lays, where she got really obsessed with like very violent biker movies, to the point where she wanted I guess this isn't a biker movie, but she wanted Sam Peckinpah to direct Play It As It Lays, which is a very funny idea, actually, if you've seen it. But, my sense is she was pretty omnivorous, which you would be if you were a film goer at that time. And she clearly saw everything, but she had very pointed views. And in her introductory column in Vogue, when she was like first hired, she was like, the thing is, I like movies and I like them to have moments, which she capitalized. And then she was like, I don't need them all to be Casablanca. And I was like, okay. But I like those moments, like in The Spirit of St. Louis, when Charles Lindbergh finishes the play. Like she just likes the big swelling. She has like pretty cheesy movie tastes, honestly. And as a movie critic, I read her criticism and I'm like, really? But then that is very reflective of what she appreciates, which is just like kind of big American nonsense. Later on, she doesn't write a lot about it, but I know she did go to the movies quite a bit. And it's funny because New York is just like full of theaters where you can see pretty much anything from any time at any point. But yeah, one of her most scathing reviews is of Shirley Clark's The Cool World. She thinks this is nonsense. And she also is very mixed on Billy Wilder, who she thinks has no sense of humor. Yeah.
Another question?
Hi. Expanding on what you were just saying, and this is just like a personal question, I guess, with like moments and movies and things. Me growing up as a girl, I loved like Disney and Marvel and stuff, and I noticed the book, you didn't talk about Disney, and I just have this in my head because we take our kids to Disneyland a lot here, because a lot of it is like nostalgia and like exposing our kids to that while we live here. So, but you did mention Marvel, so I'm wondering, did she like Disney?
She never wrote about it. I think Disney's I've written a bunch about Disney, and I think in a lot of ways Disney is like the archetypal Hollywood plot, right? Where it's like, and also, again, I grew up on, it's the same thing. But like, they were all kind of, the story was like, be yourself, don't let anyone tell you to be. I feel like she would think that was weird and bad. And again, she also might, so this is the distinction. She doesn't take movies that seriously. Like she takes them deadly seriously, but also individual movies, she's not like, why do they have this message? Or like, why, she's like, was it entertaining? Great. That's what a movie should be. And that is what separates movies from politics to her, which is like, politics should not be entertaining. Politics should be about governing and making arguments and getting people to vote for you. But to the Disney point, I literally couldn't find a single place that she mentioned Disney, which is so weird to me. It's so big, but also like Disney expanded so fast in the period in which, after Disney owns like 60% of all IP in Hollywood or something at this point. So you can read it through her lens, but there's no, and she didn't write on Marvel either, to be clear. It was just a helpful lens there.
still on this movie theme, a movie that comes to mind that doesn't seem to fit into any of the categories that you mentioned is Mulholland Drive. Yeah. Okay, so was she? Did she see that? I don't remember the dates.
I am positive she saw it. I mean, there's no way she wouldn't have seen an LA movie of that heft. But it was past, because this is like David Lynch's, in my opinion, masterpiece. But she kind of stopped writing about movies after she became a political reporter. There's very little that's directly about movies. It's a lot more about how politics have become movies. So I don't know what she would, I mean, in my opinion, she would have loved it, but that's just my prejudice. It certainly, I mean, she knew the area well. She wrote, like, a lot of her early writing about Los Angeles feels like it is the basis for Mulholland Drive to me. And she did kind of dig that, like, intuitive movie where you kind of feel it more than you understand it, yeah, which is kind of Lynch. But God bless him, R.I.P.
Hi, thank you. As two critics yourselves, how would you describe what are the biggest differences between media criticism at the heyday of when Joan was writing her criticism and now? Just to put it in context, you're talking about in your passage of the sort of relationship between reviewers and how, like, a review can kind of make or break a movie, or someone doesn't want to review something badly because of the relationship. Like, how would you compare that to now as two critics yourselves, if you can say anything about that?
I mean, so I've been at the New York Times for 18 months, which is probably one of the more powerful film critic positions. I can't make or break a big movie. People don't really care. I can make or break a small movie, right? But, like, the biggest difference on my end, on the, like, kind of media end, is, like, there's just more of it, and it comes at people from every direction, and people don't know most of what comes out. Like, people genuinely just don't have any idea that movies are coming out ever, it seems. Whereas in her case, she would have frequently been working with something that worked as a lingua franca. Like, you know, everybody had seen X, Y, and Z. A movie pops up in a theater and it's going to stay there for 8 months. Or how long did Titanic play? 2 years in theaters or something like that. That just never happens. If you get 6 months, you've, like, completely blown things out of the water. That means what I do has to be very different from what... Also, she's writing for paper, I'm writing for the internet. Those are just, like, two vastly different things. But for literary criticism, I've only written a small bit.
Well, money is the biggest difference.
No, money's... Yeah.
She got paid.
She did.
I mean, in all seriousness, it was a job. It was a thing she could, you know, build a life and a career on, splitting a column for Vogue.
Although they did get into screenwriting because the mortgage and the
there was still more
schools,
money in screenwriting, yes. But criticism did pay a little bit more. And there was more of it, more newspaper, a sense of authority, perhaps.
Yes. And like Didion and Dunn and Cale having beef would be like something people would talk about. Whereas now, if you can think of a critic beef in the US anyhow, I would be impressed.
Okay.
Hi. Kind of similar to some of the other movie questions. Did you, I guess it sounds like she wasn't writing as much about movies later in life as she's reflecting on this intersection between Hollywood and politics. Did you ever get the sense, though, that she felt some reflection, regret, culpability in, like, having been a part of Hollywood and it kind of took over the culture and it kind of took over political culture, and she participated in that? She was a screenwriter. Did she feel some ambivalence or regret or even lose her love of movies or Hollywood because of how it kind of like ate the world, so to speak? Yeah.
No, it's a really good question. I did not get that sense from anything I read. In part because, I mean, for her, the reason it took over was sort of two parts. One was invention of a camera small enough to bring onto a convention floor. Like that to her seems like the moment. She writes about that, and she writes about like running into a director who she knew from Hollywood, like on the floor of a convention that she was covering, and asking him if she could borrow his badge because she needed to get to somewhere, and he was like, no. And this was in the context of a WGA strike, and she was like, oh, right, the writers, we don't amount to anything. So it was sort of the staging everything for the camera, but she sees that as a business decision more than as a narrative decision, if that makes sense. Like that you could make money off of an election as a TV network because you could point cameras at it and people watch it. And people did used to watch those conventions. And still do to an extent, but not like they used to. And now the money is just more spread out. So for her, like a lot of her critique of Hollywood is towards the business, not towards the narrative end. It's just that the narrative is the end product. So that's what people come to expect. But the business are the one who produces the end product. And she writes, again, way back in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, I think it is, there's an essay called like politics in Hollywood or something, but she writes about like how nobody has any political convictions whatsoever in Hollywood, and everyone just kind of repeats whatever they heard last dinner party, which I honestly think is why she kept insisting she was a conservative for a really long time, because she just liked shocking people at dinner parties in Hollywood in the 60s. It doesn't really answer your question, but I really think like to her, the screenwriting was like, this should not have been a problem. She's like, I wrote Up Close and Personal. This means nothing. This is a nothing movie, right? What is A Star is Born? Like, what did that teach you? But, and it's problematic in many ways, but really it's about the kind of the business built up around it that just doesn't have any scruples. As long as it makes money and sells ads, we're good. And that is where her critique seems to lie.